Can I ask you to make your way to your seats? We want to start in 2 to 3 minutes, please. Thank you very much, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, colleagues, friends, anybody I haven't mentioned yet, do please come in and sit down. And those of you who are coming in, could you sit over on the far side rather than the near side? Sit over this way. There are comfortable seats rather than having to stand on the fringes. So let me introduce myself. My name is Dan Smith. I'm director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and we are delighted to be once again co-convening the Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development with the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We're delighted to have you all here. This has become as I think you recognize by being here, a really important event and an important meeting place for people who are working on these too often separated and really closely connected and linked issues within peace and development questions. And this year we've looked to be addressing the issue of moving from stabilization beyond into peace building, from crisis response into the long term. And that's the theme of our session this afternoon: inclusivity and participation beyond stabilization towards sustainable peace. And we have a really tremendous panel here to discuss it. As is usual, as you will have experienced already yourselves, we have a big issue, or set of issues. We have a quite large panel, and we have not nearly enough time. All right? We're highly dependent upon our good friends sitting here to think of time even as they're speaking and keep it to just 4 or so or 5 minutes each. And then there can be an exchange. Then we can go back and forth, and then also we can get the audience, we can get you participating. And in order to help with their discipline, that's why I've decided to stand. Right. By being at a higher level than them is the only way I can think of imposing any kind of discipline on a bunch like this. So have all the sympathy you can with me. Beam me your good thoughts and your energy for keeping everything running nicely and smoothly. I will introduce each speaker as we come to each speaker. And the first person whom I therefore want to invite to speak is the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Iraq, Mohammed Ali Al-Hakim. And what we've seen in the last, 2, 3, 4 years in the United Nations context is the development of course, the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, the Paris Climate Change Agreement, also the Sustaining Peace approach and the pathways to peace. And what we've been looking at, I think, is within that, in societies, especially societies which are affected by conflict, I mean, there are necessarily divisions. How do you cross those divisions? How do you, in some sense, surmount or even conquer them to get that inclusivity in the working together that's required in order to be building a sustainable peace? Please.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dan. I think this is an important issue for Iraq. Historically, Iraq in the past 40 years was in conflict since 1980, the war with Iran, and so on. So let's take this in the context of what we are doing after 2003 and moving forward, and how do we accommodate to the change that happened in 2003. We left the war as well as the sanction with a lot of debt. So Iraq in 2003 was under 73 UN Security Council resolutions under Chapter 7, and they were severe UN resolutions. It was in debt to Paris Club countries for $120 billion. It was in debt to other companies for about $300 billion, and it was also in debt to Kuwait for compensation for another $54 billion. So starting from 2003, when you want to build reconciliation and build your economy going forward, but you are already in negative, completely negative in terms of how do you deal with these things. Besides, you want to bring the whole communities, because Iraq is diverse communities. You got the Shia, the Sunnis, the Arab, the Kurds, the Turkmen, the Christians, and the Yazidis. So it's a diverse community. How do you bring them back to promote what we said, economic development? How do we take advantage of the UN and also the help of the coalition? Really, and I wanted to thank the United States today, because they really helped us in terms of the coalition, and this is important for us. 2003 to 2014, it was a struggle for Iraq, without any doubt. But what we did, we built it step by step. The first thing we built is to put a constitution, and that constitution is agreed upon by all community inside Iraq. We built on it the parliament, we built on it the government, elected government. And this is important for us to start to stabilize Iraq. However, in 2014, ISIS came in, and ISIS sort of scrambled the situation in Iraq big time and occupied 1/3 of the country. And then now, to clear ISIS out, we had to really pay a lot of young people died in between, and this is a tragedy for Iraq. We have also came out from the war. We have defeated ISIS, but we also have not defeated the ideology of ISIS. So we are still suffering, and this is really a warning for the international community. ISIS is not dead. It is actually defeated militarily in Iraq, and hopefully soon in Syria will completely cleared, and we'll be happy with defeating them militarily. Now, we'll go back to how do we promote economic development? How do we take advantage of multilateralism? How do we take advantage of the UN and its agencies in Iraq, which we are actually opened up to them, and they opened us to us. And we have a lot of people who worked in Iraq. So let me look at what the program of the current Prime Minister in 2018, which is really a program, a practical program. The new Prime Minister is a pragmatist, is a centrist, an economist. So he wants to do a program that promotes economy. First of all, decentralization to make sure that everyone can govern locally, which is very important. If we succeed, if Iraq succeeds in decentralization, I think that's a big step for us. The second point is building the private sector. Iraq is completely one huge public sector, government. So we have graduates, they look for government as an employee. So this is really an issue that we want to build on. The second thing is we have to do what's called a focus on human capital and economy. We have a lot of PhDs, but we are not taking advantage of them. Education in Iraq is free, and we have a tremendous number of PhDs, but today they are out of work. This is a human resources and economic resources. How do we take advantage of that? Third is we put our money on health and education. Health and education actually took back seats since the war in 1980. Most of the budget went to military, to support the military environment. So back to supporting health and education. In Iraq, health and education is free, but what we need to do is build on that. Empowerment of women, and this is where we get SDG 5 and the 1325 UN Security Council. And these are, Iraq is actually a leader in the Arab world in 1325 and development of 1325. And this is very big for us. Empowerment of women came in the Constitution. We have put in the Constitution a quota for women. Somebody says quota is not good, but we think it's, as a young democracy, it's not bad to have at least 25% of women elected into parliament. Today in our parliament, 83 women. Only Tunisia is ahead of us when they had 33%. So this is really something what we want to do. Empowerment of women, SDG 5 development, 1325 UN security. Job creation. This is a big issue for us. We have a lot of young people. Young people look for government employment, developing private sector, job creation program, and this is what the Prime Minister is doing for that. Building basic infrastructure services, water, clean water, electricity, housing. These are basic infrastructure that Iraq is actually doing with the help of United Nations agencies. Now we are thinking about PPP and BOT. These are the two things that we are moving in to develop with the private sector, and the Prime Minister is trying to develop the local businesses. NGO and civil society, this is very big for us, and free press. So if you put all of these together, you'll look at the program of the Prime Minister as a really very aggressive, as well as very high ceiling program he puts for the cabinet. So all in all, if you think about it, we think that the use of the UN agencies, the multilateralism in Iraq is very, very important for us. UNAMI is helping us, UNDP, ICRC, IOM is helping Iraq tremendously, and we have also the donors. We work with the EU, and we thank the EU as well for being a partner, a strong partner. EU countries, when I mean EU countries, including Sweden. They were the donor countries who came in and helped us on the humanitarian issue. Rebuilding the damaged cities like Mosul and Anbar and Salahuddin, and all of these cities where people will go back. We had 4 million IDPs. Now in camp only about 1.2 million. So you get a lot of issues done. And this is the issues that we say, to build the economy together and wrap it up with the human resources. It is the basic element that Iraq is working on.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, that's the combination of the complexity, the number of different issues, and trying to integrate those into a single strategy going forward. Very helpful. I want to move, if I can, now to John Allen, who is president of the Brookings Institution. And we are dealing with, we're talking about these peace and stabilization, peace building issues in a world which is, in some perspectives, increasingly unstable at the global level. So, I mean, if you go a few years back, one could think of a world in which there was all of this instability at local level, but you had a more or less stable architecture over the top. Now we still have this instability at the local level, and we're beginning to wonder about that architecture. Shifting dynamics of power, shifting preferences. Arguably, none of the great powers of the moment are really status quo powers. So how does this changing architecture at the global level affect the possibilities and the prospects for work at the more national and local levels? John.
Well, that's the central question I think we'll all have to answer. First, it's wonderful to be with SIPRI, and I want to thank you for the great work you have done on this subject and many others related to it. And it's wonderful to be in Sweden, a nation that stands for democracy and human rights in a very difficult world today, and it is an example for all of us. You put your finger on a major issue for us as we look out across the world. There was a trajectory of activity that has, I think, gotten some traction over the last several years, which is multilateral participation in the process of seeking first to create stability, and then from the stability moving towards the outcomes that can move a society from a conflict society, a post-conflict society, to even a developing society. The good news is, I think, that the science of the principles that are necessary to be successful, I think those are known to us. And while some states, my own country in particular, may still believe that there is a role for unilateralism in this process, I think that the track record has become very clear that on those occasions where there were multilateral national involvement and multilateral non-governmental organizational involvement, we had the greatest likelihood of success. Having served in Afghanistan, where I was involved in the peace process several years ago, having served in Iraq, where I had the great honor of serving in Al-Anbar, and where we sought to create peace locally in the province, the third of the size of Iraq, having had the great honor of being part of the Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations, where I saw this process in action, and then being part of the coalition, ultimately to defeat the so-called Islamic State, Daesh. What worked was multilateralism. What worked was the coming together of the community of nations and organizations to create coalitions with recognizable principles from which then they could become participants at multiple levels to try to move us to some form of a recognizable outcome, either to complete the conflict or move us beyond the conflict. And as the foreign minister, and it's wonderful to see you again, sir, as the foreign minister said, there were certain things we had to do, and we always have to do in this process. It is to stabilize the society, it is to build governmental capacity, it is to inject economic capacity into the situation that stabilizes it as well, work very hard ultimately on human capital development, and extraordinarily importantly, bring women into the process of peace and security. Now, you point to something that I think for me and for many others who have had some sense of optimism that we were getting this multilateralism right over the last several years. You point to what would appear to be the wobbling of the strategic powers, if you will. And frankly, the very ambivalent signals or ambiguous signals that are being sent out of Washington on a number of these issues. It's going to be very difficult for us ultimately to solve Yemen, for example, if the United States isn't taking a leadership position with many of the other states represented in this room. It'll be very difficult for us to work closely with the Iranians ultimately to contain their nuclear ambitions when in fact the peace-building process, that was really a treaty, but the peace-building process had great promise in taking us to a point for stability in the Middle East that was not just a Middle East effort, but it was a European effort, it was an American effort, and we had a piece of paper that was signed by Russia, China, and the United States, the P5, the EU, and Germany. We've seen so seldom opportunities for that to occur. So the trajectory, I think, for multilateralism, not just at a national level, but incorporating NGOs from the very beginning, is a positive development in the most recent past. And much of that came from U.S. leadership. Not alone, because it was U.S. partnership in many respects with countries like Sweden that does stand for peace, that does stand for human rights and democracy. But when we see the potential for ambivalence or the potential for ambiguity on what we now see that the U.S. stands for in this regard, it makes it very difficult to create the coherent multilateralism that is necessary to find our way out of conflict.
So if I can just ask you, answering if you possibly can within about 20, 30 seconds, do you think this is just a blip, or is it something that's lasting and that we need to get used to? I'm not asking you to depress us or cheer us up. I'm asking you to give us your sense of what the horizon is, what it looks like into the mid-2020s.
Sure. Well, the horizon could be 2020. And a lot of Americans, I think, would like to see that horizon be 2020. But I make the point that, look, there is a very, very strong American inclination to the things I've just described, where human rights are not an ambiguous term. Human rights are a very important dimension of what we stand for. The shift and the drift towards illiberalism is of great concern to many of us in the United States, where the multilateral approach to peace has to be at the heart of it, because if it's not a multilateral approach and it's a unilateral interventionist approach, then we have no reason to believe that it will be sustainable. So I don't know whether it is a longer-term approach. My sense is, in my deep relations and contacts with the body of American leaders that exist today, the utter and unambiguous commitment to finding peaceful solutions to these conflicts by incorporating the capabilities and the energies and the enthusiasms of our partners around the world who are like motivated in a similar set of values, that I think has not changed. And if the election changes the administration in 2020, I think you'll see a relatively quick and unambiguous statement of what we stand for. If it doesn't, then I think we'll see 4 more years of the challenges that we face.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. I wanted to turn now to Ahmed Isse Awad, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Somalia, and come back down, in a sense, from the national level in Iraq. We've looked at the global environment. Let's now look again at the national level in Somalia and think about how to connect the opportunity that you have today, the relative peace that there is in Somalia, to the prospects for a lasting peace. The 4.5 peace and state building process, which is often talked about, is based on 4 clans, and a 0.5 is a kind of half a clan or a small clan, a clanette. But that process which you've been taking forward, do you think that holds the seeds for this self-sustaining peace, which is what we want to see, of course, not just in Somalia, but everywhere, but particularly in Somalia, which has had decades of turbulence and insecurity and uncertainty? Minister.
Well, thank you, Dan. And I've been repeating in answer to a number of interrelated questions today and in the past, some consistent themes, and I will get back to that in my answer to your question. And I hope I will not be very boring to those of you who have heard me repeat this over and over again. And your question is relevant in this sense, and I think the 4.5 formula, which has been debated in Somalia, some have seen it as what's holding back from progress. Others saw it's the only way forward. It has been debated in Somalia. And the reason and I am of the opinion that this 4.5, which has been introduced in the first serious peace conference in Somalia, in Arta, Djibouti, in 2000, and has been since endorsed in all the successive peace processes in Nairobi, in Djibouti, back in Somalia, is that this is the best formula for the time being. This 4.5, for those of you who are not familiar with the Somali political scene, 4.5 is a power sharing formula where the Somali society is divided into 4 major tribes, and a collection of tribes that get half of what the 4 major tribes get in the parliament. It is a power sharing formula. And the reason it's introduced, the reason I subscribe to it, not only because it's the law of the country, is embedded in the charter, in the constitution that Somalia, that's in effect in Somalia, but I'm also convinced as a student of governance and politics and also post-conflict building and state building. The reason I'm convinced is that, and why this formula have served us very well, in spite of its four shortcomings. First of all, it's a transitional arrangement. It's a formula for reconciliation. It is because when the Somali state collapsed, people attribute to the reason for that collapse because of bad governance, because of oppressive governance. We don't repeat this lest we go back to the history, but this was the assumption. And because the war was raging, tribes were fighting. Nobody had a census. There was no possibility of holding elections. So how could people come together to form again a government that is basis for the reconstitution of the Somali state? So these people came with this formula. They said, we don't know the numbers, so let's assume these 4 tribes are equal and they get equal numbers. And these other tribes who were smaller tribes, they are seen as nobody has the numbers, but they were marginalized, they never got a role, should get half of what the major tribes get. And then today we spoke about women were also given a quota. Now that was a formula, as I said, of power sharing, formula of reconciliation, and it served us. It sustained the peace. We had, of course, other problems that we faced, but since that was introduced, Somalia has had a number of transitions and elections, a number of presidents, 5, let me count, 1, 2, 3, 4, yes, 5 presidents have changed hands. And this process made it possible. The idea was, one is the country stabilizes, and there is a permanent constitution, and there is a census, then elections will happen, a universal suffrage, 1 person, 1 vote, and then we will leave this formula behind. But for the time being, this has sustained us. It sustained us because now it may not be perfect, but the government power of the country is shared. So you have the president coming from one group, you have the prime minister coming from another group, you have not to say a tribe or clan. We practice tribal, and then we also are not comfortable of saying it publicly. So, and therefore I'm using the word group. So a president comes from one group, prime minister comes from the other group, the speaker of the parliament comes from the other group. Now we have also the Senate from another group, and so on. It really stabilized the country. People felt that they belonged to the country, all of them. While in the past, people were seeing the person who is at the top, at the helm, the president, could make decisions that are life and death for people, and could make anyone he wants rich, and could deprive any other group they felt of their right of citizenship. So this was in response to the history of our country. And from the outsiders, and even from some in Somalia, they will look at this as a very kind of backward, non-democratic formula. But it serves Somalia for the time being. It's a transitional, and I think it was also addressing two critical issues that we have to overcome. It is in strengthening the trust among the communities that has been severed by the civil war. It is also giving people or strengthening or building people's trust once again in the government and in the state, because the state has lost legitimacy in the eyes of the people due to past practices, and the people have killed each other. This is what I was referring to this morning in this seat when I was talking about deficit of confidence at different levels, at the horizontal level and at the vertical level, among the communities and between the society and the state. And now this formula is a way of winning back the trust of the people and the confidence people have in each other at the community level, and as well as the confidence and the trust people would have in the state. Now, to complete the circle and to move out of this formula, which was supposed to be a temporary and transition, and to move to a universal suffrage, lasting constitution, sustainable peace, we have to get to a point where the state is legitimate, people accept it, and that to happen, we need the support, we need two other elements to come in. The Somalis by then have done their part by coalescing among themselves, building consensus, coming together and building their own state and new foundations that based on the consent of the people and us rethinking, reconceptualizing the idea of a state, or the raison d'etre of a state, which was not mostly known to us, that it was an alien concept to us, borrowed or inherited from the colonial powers. Now the two factors that could help us cross that bridge is external forces, which I divided into two. One is the regional, and one is the broader international community. We're talking about multilateralism and the role it can play in furthering peace and stability in the world. So we have succeeded in Somalia of overcoming another mistrust, this time towards the region. So now the Horn of Africa region is becoming together, and we are on the path of political cooperation and economic integration, following the AU Vision 2063. So that is very important for us, because as long as we are in conflict with the region, with our neighbors, then we could not sustain, we wouldn't have a space or time to build this consensus. We still face challenge now from other actors outside our region, maybe not so far away from us, that are impacting negatively on us. I'm concluding by this. So the region of the Horn of Africa is also, and the region coming together bodes well for us sustaining our peace and progress. The last one is the role of the larger community, including Sweden and even other places. Here too, the support that's given to Somalia in a very meaningful, active way of strengthening institutions. A country that has collapsed 40 years ago. We need that support from the international community. I'm glad I'm here in this forum to share this perspective with you, and I'm grateful to the role that Sweden and other partners are playing, including the United Nations. However, I think there is a critical intervention needed right now so that the pace of the progress is made faster. Yeah. Because the Somali people, the youth are 70% of the population. We are impatient. We are facing the challenge of Al-Shabaab, and we are facing the challenge of winning legitimacy again for the state. So that's why we are appealing to the international community to not hold back with their support to.
I'm sure they won't. Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you. I want to move now to a different context, which is, one could say, even a bit more localized, as Nigeria, and especially northern Nigeria. Fatima Shehu Imam is director of civil society organization in Borno State in Nigeria. And I want to ask you how you see these issues playing out in Nigeria, where you have both the pressure from Boko Haram and you have the pressure from climate change and the effects in the Niger Delta, and you have the demographic and the economic and the development issues all kind of coming together at once and trying to then, within that context, be building a sustainable peace. So if you can just give us a sense of your perspectives on both the problems and as you see them the way forward.
Thank you, Mr.
It'll come on.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Moderator, Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I think
can you hear her?
It can't be heard, huh?
You can get closer to your mouth.
No, I don't
Do
think
I
so.
need a
Can you turn up the volume?
It's good now.
Okay,
All right.
it took
Thank
a while.
you. I was saying, is it too loud? Thank you, Mr. Moderator, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I thank SIPRI for giving me the opportunity, a local civil society organization from Borno State, to represent communities and voices of people who otherwise would not be heard. And I thank you very much for your question. However, I think I would focus more on northeastern Nigeria, where I feel I have more knowledge and I can be able to talk authoritatively. So, to say that for those that have been following development in northern Nigeria, I don't think the issue of violent extremism will come to them as a surprise, because all the indices that are drivers of the conflict have been there for a very long time. You would know that northern Nigeria, northeastern particularly, has been accounting for low development indices in terms of education, in terms of infrastructure and everything, such that the Jamaatul Ahl al-Sunnah Lidawati wal Jihad, otherwise known as the Boko Haram conflict, Boko Haram group, now giving rise to this conflict, is basically an exclusion issue. Exclusion from socio-economic opportunities and failure of governance to address the gap in terms of inequalities. The group saw that gap in governance and then capitalized on it. So in terms of trying to define what Boko Haram is as a group, I think it's very difficult. It's a very complex conflict. It's dynamic. It does not have any clear religious delineation. And as such, it is just a little of everything. There are perspectives that believe the insurgency is political, others believe it's religious, some people believe it's economic, that there are some people that benefit that actually do not even want it to end. And I think it's like a potpourri, you know, all of them are actually right. And as such, it will require a multifaceted approach to ensure that we arrive at a lasting peace. Even though my comment on countering on violent extremism is going to focus on northern Nigeria, I think I would like to state that it has started as a local uprising that metamorphosed into a regional crisis with some international links and causing stability around the Lake Chad Basin. What I see this as an opportunity is for me to bring the perspective of the people that I seek to represent. I am a civil society activist, and we're talking peace building. I think since morning the conversation has been around peace building. I heard a question asked in the morning, what actually do we mean by peace building? And probably that is the issue. Do we actually look at peace building in the context of the conflict that we're discussing? In the communities that I represent, the perspective is as follows. Communities actually feel that their voices are overlooked. They feel neglected. They feel that their needs, their concerns, their aspirations are not considered by the government as well as the international community. The feeling is that at most or at best, community leaders and religious leaders are being consulted, which is not representative of voices of the communities. Because of the displacement that's going on, most of the community leaders live outside of their communities for a very long time, such that we cannot say that their opinions are representative of what the people actually want. Secondly, it can be that also they also have their own biases and prejudices that can be religious or political or ethnic. And as such, it should be in such a way that communities are actually represented. When we're talking especially about inclusivity, when we just look at a particular group within the community, we would not say that the community is included. Talking about women as well, where I come from, women voices are not heard. Women are just to be seen. They are excluded in a lot of decision-making processes, even in peace building. And that is a very critical component. In fact, with this insurgency, we are talking about 80 to 87% women and children, and that critical and important component is excluded in the decision-making processes and in peace building. And as such, there is a need to include that important category. And looking also at the response, it has been that we are looking at it from a militarized response or from the humanitarian response. The humanitarian response, for example, looks at addressing the consequences of the violence and not necessarily looking at finding a durable solution or a durable or lasting peace. So what is most needed is to ensure that the solution looks at a longer-term solution. And that ties into the issue of public trust in government and also in the security. Presently, it speaks to a diminishing hope. Communities are actually under a lot of mistrust when it comes to government as well as the international community, owing to the fact that, for example, a lot of resources has been spent in the whole intervention, and then when you look at the impact, especially issues around peace building, it seems as if nothing has been done. The issue of reintegration, for example, of perpetrators, which also is a very important component of ensuring that there is peace building. It's done usually based on the interest of either government or the international community, and not necessarily what the communities want or what the communities need. It is seen as a form of forced reintegration, for example. As you all are aware, the Boko Haram insurgency is happening at different levels. Some communities are healing, while others are freshly traumatized. And as such, there is the need to consult these communities to be able to know if actually they are ready to be able to go through these processes. But most often, because it is either the mandate of an international organization or because it is donor driven, then it is seen as if communities need to really accept it whether or not they are ready. And that brings about a lot of resistance from such communities. Besides, such strategies are not locally owned, they are not locally relevant. And that goes to the issue of the voices of the communities that I have mentioned earlier. Because in the design and in the planning of responses and strategies, communities have not been involved. So in that sense, they do not feel as if they are a part of the solution, and as such, they usually do not accept it. One also very important component that we really need to talk about is the issue of accountability and justice. And we need to ask this critical question. Is our government actually ready to address the issue of impunity? It is very much important for us to know that perpetrators are being brought to book. But then how do we do that? And then international community, is it posed in such a way that it can be able to support the process of ensuring that perpetrators are brought into book so that we avoid retaliation from these communities? It's also important to know that the Boko Haram conflict is different in that communities actually know who these perpetrators are. People actually witness their family members being killed or abducted or kidnapped in front of them. And as such, the whole process of justice and accountability is very personal to these communities, that until and unless we ensure that there is a mechanism in place that seeks to address the issue of justice, whether it is transitional justice or in whichever way, then the issue of peace building will not have the desired impact. And I think one thing we also need to have at the back of our minds is the fact that we don't have to copy from other contexts. We really appreciate experience sharing and sharing of best practices, but I feel solutions should come from communities. I think even the northern Nigeria as a whole do not have to be subjected to one way of addressing the issue. It has to come from community to community, depending on what the needs of these communities are. And then I would like to bring to the notice of this gathering, because like I said earlier, this is an opportunity for us to actually talk about issues that are very close to our hearts. And this is very personal to me. Every morning when I take my children to the school, on the way I see these hundreds of orphaned, unaccompanied, and separated children roaming the streets every morning. These children are already undergoing a form of radicalization. They are exposed to extreme coldness, they're exposed to extreme heat, they're exposed to extreme hunger. They are now in a situation where they feel nobody cares for them. There's no affection from anybody within the community. They are becoming resentful. And this is an issue. Unfortunately, all of us are guilty of the fact that we do not respond to issues until it becomes a crisis. This is a crisis waiting to happen. If you look at the large number, we're talking about over 500,000 orphaned, unaccompanied, and separated children that are being roaming the streets in host communities and in camps. I believe this should be an eye-opener if we really want to look at peace, sustainable peace, in such a way that we're looking at a lasting solution. That is one component that we begin to think proactively to say, in the next 10 years, we're going to look at a group that probably we cannot be able to contain, Probably that is going to be worse than the Boko Harams that we're seeing and the ISIS that we're seeing. And this is a clarion call upon all and sundry to ensure that we raise to the occasion and look at the peace process, not only at the short term of looking at DDR, but also this disaster that is actually waiting to happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Well done.
So, Peter Maro, whom we've, of course, heard from this morning, is president of the ICRC. And Peter, you just heard a remark there that I'm sure you made a mental note at, which is that the humanitarian response is dealing with the consequences and what is of violence. And what is needed is building a durable peace. So one of the issues, I think, for the ICRC is, what is your relationship to that transition from the moment of violence where you have the prime role into that long-term development of peace?
Well, as I have mentioned already this morning, I'm sometimes a little bit wary about the concepts that we are using. We deal with humanitarian peace, human rights, and those concepts as if they were somehow close areas which have to be brought in contact with each other in order to do better somewhere. And I think that's the wrong concept. When I look why we are at a place, two words which Mohammed, Ahmed, Fatima have used over the last 20 minutes recurrently were trust and inclusion. And I think when I see how we conceive humanitarian work, it's basically trust building and coping with the frustrations of exclusions and the consequences of exclusions, and trying to formulate a humanitarian action in a way that it brings people together and overcomes some of the fragmentations. Being a frontline operator, that starts with us. I mean, negotiating consensual humanitarian activity amongst belligerents and those who are in control of territory in order to deliver safely towards communities is the essence of what we do. And I think it is important that we conceive humanitarian action increasingly, and we start looking proactively out for those projects and programs which allow us to bring communities together which have been divided by war and violence. That's why it is not a technocratic job to build a clinic at the front line. It's basically ideally the result of consensus amongst belligerents to provide and to bring back services into the communities and to allow those from different communities also to reconnect around humanitarian activities. That's the reason why the design of humanitarian activities and the humanitarian response is absolutely essential. You can design a response in order which will prolong the divisions in society, or you can design it in a way that it brings people together again. And I think that's our reconnection and perspective to what peace building is. Afterwards, we know that there are subjects which are difficult when you bring them into the discussion at front lines in the middle of war. But that's then other actors who have to deal with them. But I think what we do as humanitarian actors is not alien to peace building. It's ideally the first step towards to the building block to peace building. With regard to our second big chunk of what we do, international humanitarian law in that sense is also an entry point into opening key issues which allows to cope with, yes, I agree, Fatima, with the impact of war and violence, but it is also to ensure non-recurrence and to prepare healing. Why is it so important that we visit detention facilities, we establish relations between detainees and families, we search for missing people, and we try to reconnect families in, during, and after war? It's important because it's seen by people as critical elements of what international humanitarian law presents and which allow them to go back to normal life. So my concept of international humanitarian law and humanitarian action is not at all that it is just done in a mitigating logic. It has to point towards the next step. It has to bring us out of the vicious circle of violence. I mean, when I met first General Allen, we had a discussion on the use of force of the US troops in Afghanistan. And I think we engage with more than 140 armed forces in the world and with more than 200 non-state armed groups in the world, not just to keep them in line with international humanitarian law, but also to have respectful use of force even in the conduct of operations so that reconciliation after war is easier. We know from too many places in which we are. When the law has been violated outrageously and systematically, you won't easily find back a way to reconciliation. So our engagement on international humanitarian law is not just mitigating for tomorrow. It's basically finding behavior, even in the worst of circumstances, which allows reconciliation afterwards. And I think that's the whole issue we are discussing here. I think we should go away from bureaucratic logics of connecting bureaucracies in order to do better into putting the issues, and here I fully agree with Fatima, putting the concerns of the people at the front and then see who can do what in order to support, to accompany what populations need in difficult circumstances. That's the reason why in all these discussions, don't you overstep your mandate. I have kind of a strange feeling because at the end of the day, what is the mandate? The mandate is to alleviate suffering, to respond to needs of people. And I think it is important that those who are there, those who are with the populations have an ability to interact, to charter forward a way forward. That's the reason why fixing a water distribution system somewhere can be a developmental task, but it can also be a humanitarian task which is constituent to peace building. And I think this is where we are today, looking for the soft spots which allow us to move in those areas which are establishing consensual humanitarianism as a building block and a stepping stone to a more stable society. I'm very much aware this doesn't solve the problem, and we ourselves put borders to what we do. There are obvious issues when we can't get to consensus where we have to stop because it would be too dangerous for us and it would destroy the whole concept of consensual humanitarianism. Accountability for war crimes, I fear to say, cannot be my business. Not that I am not deeply committed to accountability for war crimes, but if we would, in the midst of combat operations, start to talk about accountability, and if this would be the main issue of conversations with belligerents, we wouldn't be doing what we do, saving lives. So we are confronted with difficult dilemmas, which we have.
But you're talking about a division of labor, and then the question is labor for what? And it's labor for building peace, because that is the way that the suffering won't recur.
Well, that's the reason why this morning at the end of my speech I referred to our founding fathers, because I think in the technocratic development of bureaucracies for peace, human rights, and humanitarian, we have forgotten, in particular as humanitarians, that those who founded modern humanitarianism didn't it to be humanitarians. They wanted to make a contribution for peace.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Peter. And now I want to turn to Annika Söder, who is the State Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Sweden. And Annika, you've got behind you a couple of years on the UN Security Council. And during your time on the UN Security Council, or at the very beginning of it, the new Secretary General came in with a prevention agenda. And then there were issues which Sweden wanted to raise, and there are other issues as well being developed of sort of long-term questions. And at the same time, you have, of course, the crises which arise month by month and week by week, and even more often than that. And there were some big ones during the period. I mean, Yemen, Syria, well, indeed Libya, indeed Nigeria, and others. So what kind of lessons have you learned from this short-term, long-term issue, which is part of what we're talking about here, part of about dealing with today in a way that makes for a better tomorrow?
Thank you for a very complicated question.
No, any time. I've got a couple more.
There has been a very strange debate in Sweden if it was useful that Sweden sat on the Security Council or not. And I would like to say that there are two answers to that. One is yes, we were very successful, and I will come back to that. And no, because the international climate and environment has deteriorated so much over the last 3-4 years that a true intervention that would really change something immediately on the ground was hardly possible to achieve. And the authoritarianism and the unilateralism that characterize some of the permanent members of the Council prevented us from doing many important things. But having said that, I wanted to mention a few features that I find important. And listening to John Allen, the peace-building concept, I believe we need to widen a little bit in this very difficult climate. The JCPOA, for example, the agreement with Iran that we are all parties to, now the US leaving, is actually a peace-building effort. It's a non-proliferation effort, it's a contribution to regional stability and so forth. And now that it is at risk, it's very worrying. The other is how we were able in the Council to deal with the nuclear capabilities of North Korea, where consensus prevailed and where we took on a role as go-betweens because of our long-standing relations with North Korea. And this is another disarmament and non-proliferation effort. So I want to make a pledge to everyone that disarmament, when it comes to weapons of mass destruction, and in particular nuclear disarmament, should be very high on our agenda. And then when we use the concept inclusion, of course that's extremely important, but if people do not survive, they cannot be included. And this international global dilemma and problem, we need to address that. When it comes to inclusion, many of my friends here on the panel have stressed important factors like hope, trust, participation, and prospects for the future. And that is why I believe where multilateralism also come in, because multilateral approaches are supposedly not carried by immediate interests, but the interests of rebuilding a country or helping a country to relapse, to avoid relapsing into conflict. So that is why that approach is so important. We struggle with a few ways to make the Security Council take its responsibility. Early warning and early action. very difficult. We did not succeed on that. And if we look at national conflicts that evolve into regional conflicts and proxy wars, early intervention in one way or the other would have been a very important remedy and would have led to avoiding a lot of suffering. We try to look at transitions, how if we have a successful peace mission from the UN or from coalitions, how do we see to it that when that operation stops, there is enough support for building the society in the material sense, economically and socially, but also when it comes to reparation, accountability, transitional justice, and dealing with all the difficulties that you will have after such a situation. We have specialized in Liberia, where we have tried to provide the accompaniment for Liberia as the mission leaves, and it looks fairly positive, I must say, and knock on wood, but this is actually a way where we can contribute. I also wanted to mention our normative work on women, peace and security, and the involvement of women in peace negotiations. We managed to get language into almost all Security Council resolutions on the involvement of women in avoiding conflict and in peace agreements. Research shows that a peace agreement is 25% more likely to stick if women are involved. Unfortunately, this is not known in conflict-prone countries, and I was thinking of that when I was listening to Fatima. Our foreign minister, Margot Wallström, went to northern Nigeria together with the Deputy Secretary General to try to support women, to support regional efforts by governors and others to overcome all the aspects of that situation that you mentioned, Fatima. The success so far is that we have a resolution that mentions climate and security as something that needs to be addressed in the Lake Chad region. And a word on a paper is only a word on a paper, but I hope that this will be followed. Same when it comes to children in armed conflict. We moved forward on the normative side. We have made new recommendations for addressing the plight of children in 30 countries. And same with the involvement of youth. But my overall reflection is that much more needs to be done by leaders in warring parties, by leaders in domestic conflict, by the UN system, by civil society organizations that come into conflict situations, because we are not carrying this message strongly enough, and we are not supporting the local efforts in the way that actually could make a true difference. Finally, I wanted to say a few words about climate in general, because that is also something that we have tried to move on, that is now being followed by other non-permanent members of the Security Council in concrete conflict situations, but also more on the normative side. And with some countries turning their backs on multilateral agreements, and at least the Paris Agreement, I think we need to do much more on the ground to support and understand what climate actually brings when it comes to war, conflict and strife.
Thank you, Annika. Thank you. Well, I suppose it's inevitable if you set up a session entitled Inclusivity and Stabilization that you will include an awful lot of different issues. And I think it's been a very rich diet that we've received this afternoon. There is time for some questions or comments, and then a round of responses from the panel, which I think I'll probably do in the same order as we took their first comments and interventions. So there are two roving mics, and the first hand to go in the air gets allowed to hold one. That was there. And is there another one over on the... Yes, there's one here.
Good afternoon. My name is Shinyar, founder of Women Democracy Program, Kurdistan, Iraq. My question for Iraqi Minister of Foreign Affairs, you mentioned that Iraq has 25% of parliament seats for women, but it is a quota system. Maybe you agree with me that women in a cabinet are very absent or only one. How many do you have women as ambassador? I think it is a few. Why? I asked the question because women is important, having women is important leadership position. Is very important for peace. Women are not victims of violence only. They are pillar of peaceful community as well. My question is, what will you do to bring more women to key government position, or is that part of Abdul Wahid government strategy to bring women to important leadership position like governors, minister? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very clear and good question. And there was one here. And is there another one over there in the middle? Yep. But wait a second, because lady here first. Just hold it there. It'll come in a second. Can you turn the volume up? Yeah, okay. We'll change mics. Don't touch anything as you do it. Just hold it and talk.
Hi, my name is Mohammed. I'm representing Pakistan. I'm an academician by profession, and this entire day has been very educating for me. But I come from a part of the world where we've been in conflict indirectly for the last 17 years. I'm talking about Afghanistan. And the latest development between United States and Iran is extremely worrying for us, because when you talk about inclusivity and when you talk about collective responses and when you talk about non-proliferation, we do not understand that how can a peace initiative in Afghanistan really take off from the ground when you have a neighbor alienated the way it is, and that is Iran. And to think Iran is not a stakeholder is wrong. We also have a very precarious, delicate relationship with Iran. But at the same time, we understand that if you're talking about peace, then how do you keep one very important stakeholder out of the matrix?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And then there was one here, a gentleman with a cap, and he's helpfully standing up. And there could be one more, and it just depends which one I arbitrarily see first. The back there, just to the left of where the cameras are, left as I look.
Thank you so much,
Please,
and
sir.
thank you to the panel. I'm from Open Dana, from Plan International. I just want to find out from you, with in all the experiences with inclusiveness when it comes to building peace and stability, are there any examples where you've actually included children and young people, in particular girls, in the processes of peace?
Good question. And then the last one from here.
Thank you. I'm Jamila from Yemen. I just wanted to ask this question related to the paradigm that you have as a title for this session, which does not necessarily work for Yemen, because if we're talking about inclusive peace and then stabilization, and that means sustainable development, this is a question to donor countries. In Yemen, we have stabilized areas and governorates. We have warring or hot spots of conflict. So you cannot, in general, talk about stabilization in the whole of Yemen, but you could talk more about development in certain areas, humanitarian work in some areas. And the third area, you can work about de-escalation of the conflict. So where would this put us in if we're talking about in this paradigm? We need a more flexible paradigm that addresses the needs of the people. If we're talking about most of the areas in Yemen, yes, there is stabilization. They're ready to move to development. They don't need to be handed with humanitarian kits or food or aid. They need sustainable, or the beginning of going back to development. So this is not a question, actually. This is like a demand for the donors, for the UN agencies, for that to look upon different areas, formulas that they can work on. Doesn't have to go in this order that we're talking about. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. So there was a question directly about women's participation in Iraq. There's a question about inclusivity extending to children and especially to girls in peace processes. There's a question about the geopolitical region around neighboring Afghanistan and the effects of the US-Iran standoff on that. And then finally, there's a question about drawing on Yemen, which would be that I think if you can't have the microphone back to correct me if I misinterpret you now, but what I hear out of that is the discussion that peace doesn't move in a straight line, that it's contradictory, that you make progress in one part of the country and not necessarily in the other, that things can be disordered, and how do we handle that? So pick your own question or questions to comment on, a couple of minutes each, but Minister, you were so well disciplined in your first intervention that I'm allowing you extra time if you wish to take it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, it's good. It's working.
It's working? Okay. For the question from the lady from Kurdistan, of course, we are very happy to talk about the women progress. As a matter of fact, the quota, because we are a young democracy, that's why the Constitution has fixed the quota system. I am not a believer in a quota system. I believe in a free election and the involvement of women in politics, as well as in different facets of life. But because we are a young democracy, so we fixed at least 25% in parliament to get members of parliament. In terms of cabinet ministers, that is really fluctuating, because if you look at the cabinet of Dr. Ayad Allawi, which is the first cabinet I was a member of, we had 6 cabinet ministers. Then Dr. Jafari also had, the following prime minister had 6 cabinet minister women. But then it started going lower and lower. In the current cabinet minister, I think we expect 1, which is the Minister of Education, to be woman. We believe it is not the right direction we are going, but this is part of coalition government. And coalition government, sometimes the prime minister does not have full control on the ministers that he appoints or the coalitions or the parties will appoint. In terms of foreign ministry, I'll come into myself because I think this is very important. We only have 3 ambassadors and 1 deputy minister ladies, but we do have about 35 to 40% of the diplomats are women, which is quite high for a foreign ministry. And this is really a high number of percentage. Now we are trying to select the young generation of new ambassadors. I promised myself to have more women as an ambassadors, and this is what I'm going to do going forward. In terms of having them in the right place to make decisions, I think you are absolutely right. We're still short on that, and I think Iraq could do better in terms of we have a lot of qualified women. They could actually lead, and they proved that they could actually lead. So it is part of it. It's our shortfall on not hiring women in the right places. But in terms of foreign ministry, I am going to appoint more ambassadors as we go forward into that.
Thank you very much. And now as we move into the other 5 of you, you all have 2 minutes each. Don't think you can take as much time as Mohammed did, but you took precisely 4. It was perfect. John.
Well, let me first say that as a commander in 3 of the 4 conflicts that I was engaged in, the role of the ICRC could not have been more important to us. And I will always be grateful for the humanitarian dimension that the ICRC represented in all of those conflicts for us. It was an enormously important role. To the State Secretary's view or comment, Annika's comment on climate, I just lectured recently to a group of senior NATO leaders, and I told them that the great threat that NATO faces out beyond the year 2050 is climate change and the destabilization and the humanitarian crisis that it will create, and that we better be thinking in ways very soon about how we will become engaged in dealing with climate. The Paris Accord, of course, is one that the United States committed itself to. It's now withdrawn. I think there's still time in the event of a change of administration after the 2020 election for the United States to re-enter it, and I suspect it would. With respect to peace in Afghanistan, the concern that I and others would have as we observe this process going forward, having personally negotiated with one of the Taliban elements in Afghanistan, I had no expectation in the end that they would honor that agreement. I have no expectation that they'll honor this agreement. The sad dimension of this is that the narrative, the Taliban narrative, we talked about this a little earlier today, that the government of Ashraf Ghani and the central government of Afghanistan is an illegitimate international formulation or construction. When we bilaterally insert ourselves into a peace process that excludes the central government and thereby the Afghan people, I think it makes it extraordinarily difficult to find our way to a comprehensive peace agreement. With respect to Iran's role in Afghanistan, until the election of Ahmadinejad, Iran was actually one of the largest donors into the outcome in Afghanistan. It was a very reasonable player in the process. That changed with President Ahmadinejad's election, but today there are still more than 1 million Afghans in Iran, and Iran should have a voice in this process. Sadly, we are ideologically driven in this process to exclude Iran from virtually any forum where it could in fact have a useful role to play. And when we find in Iran capable individuals like President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif, who actually can represent the country in a reasonable way in these various forums, and to exclude Iran simply because it's Iran, I think that we do that to our detriment. And as we all know, in terms of inclusivity and inclusion, if you leave one key player out, they will often be the spoiler, and that will ultimately prevent us from having the comprehensive peace that we would desire. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Ahmed, a couple of minutes of comment on anything on the questions. You pass. Okay. Then, Fatima.
Okay. In response to the question asking what we do, including women and children in the responses, I think that is the challenge. Where I come from, it is highly patriarchal that the focus and emphasis is on men, it's male-dominated, such a way that women especially are not given the opportunity to contribute their quota. And that is what we're trying to do to ensure that we change the narrative in such a way that women take their rightful position in the scheme of things. As civil society organization, as a woman-led organization especially, we're trying to ensure that in our programs, in our implementation of our programs, we give women priority, and then we also include children. Like I rightly said, the statistics is there. The majority of those affected are women and children. And as such, we ensure that we have that conversation with government, with relevant stakeholders, to ensure that in designing, in planning, implementation, that women and children are given priority, and also not just to tick the boxes, but to ensure that they are there for the purpose that they intended and for the right purposes. And I think as women, time has come for us to not just look at invited spaces, but to begin to invent spaces ourselves, such that our voice are being heard and being heard stronger. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fatima. Peter Maurer.
Just to continue where Fatima ended, and confirm from our side as well, true inclusiveness, as you would understand it and we would understand it here, is very difficult to realize with regard to children and youth. There are, though, programs in which youth and children have particular attention. First, in our detention work, we do have specific programs for youth detained all over the world. We have a specific focus on youth and children in our psychosocial support program for traumatized victims of conflict. And we do have a specific focus on young women entrepreneurs in our cash grant programs, because we know that women overall and young women are particularly good in managing cash grants compared to men. Return on investment is uncomparable.
Absolutely.
With regard to the question from the lady from Yemen, or with regard to Yemen, I just wanted to emphasize that today we live in an increasingly fragmented world where needs have to be assessed not necessarily on country level, but in bigger granularity. We see countries which are in conflict, where we have big humanitarian programs and which are middle-income countries. Ukraine, Iraq, Syria are middle-income countries. They are not the poorest, and so humanitarian assistance looks different. Within countries as well, we don't have anymore a carpet covering country program. We know that differences are huge within the countries, and we need to calibrate a humanitarian assistance and protection program according to needs, and needs are different from one region to another region, from one country to another country. Finally, I would like to emphasize that also we live a big transformation of the needs landscape. I think up till a couple of years ago, when I would have asked in a public like this, what is humanitarian assistance, you would all have responded to 99%, it's medical, sanitation, water, shelter, food. Today, we are going much beyond. I mentioned psychosocial support. I think when we look at digital connectivity today, data security, data protection are critical in humanitarian assistance. Having a whole set of new needs is of critical importance. I still remember, and it was during my tenure as a president of ICRC where we lived the shift. It may be an interesting example to conclude. During the 2015 Gaza war, ICRC has pretty well understood that we are going to war, so we stockpiled medicine. But at the end of the day, when the war broke out, what we saw is that people wanted electricity to be connected with their cell phone to communicate about the war. So we see shifting landscape, and I think agility, flexibility, specificity towards the needs landscape and the countries in which we operate is of critical importance.
Thank you so much, Peter. And I think that warning against, homogenizing everything in a country or thinking that needs never change, extremely important. Annika, the last word is yours.
Quickly, I'd like to thank Plan for the question and also for the excellent collaboration we've had on children in armed conflict with Plan and a few other Swedish and international NGOs in order to move that forward. I don't think that we have managed to really work with young people and girls really as agents, but they are involved, and what we are trying to do through our Women's Mediation Network is also to support local mediation, for example, in Afghanistan, where I guess that also the work of another Swedish NGO, the Swedish Committee, is playing a very important role also when it comes to fostering some sort of understanding also at the local level, including women and children. On Yemen, I'd like to recognize what was said, because it has become more and more clear to us since we worked with Yemen intensively over the last year with the Stockholm Agreement and further involvement, that the situation varies really between the different regions. But the media portray is that it's a human suffering that covers the entire country, which is actually not the case. So we need to diversify also our approaches to development in Yemen as we support this very fragile peace process. Finally, on the exclusion of Iran in talks related to the region, I very much agree with John that bringing actors into talks is not a reward, it's a necessity.
That's right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you, please, to the whole panel. There are bound to be questions that needed to be posed, and we just haven't had time. Time is so often the enemy in this kind of event. But I'm sure you agree that the panel really did us proud. It was really a rich conversation. So thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm not quite picking up the hand signals.
Are you in Maiduguri? I'm coming to Maiduguri beginning of September.
That is great, sir.
What it is that you can stay or you can come down. It depends what you would like to do. They're moving. Okay, thanks very much. So we will be in a moment welcoming onto the stage the Foreign Minister of Sweden, Margot Wallström, to hear from her. Just a second as this all gets sorted. Please be patient. Thank you very much for your attention this afternoon. Yeah. Mic back for a second. I'll let you into a little problem that happened there, was that I looked over there and I couldn't see Margot. That was what the problem was. So now I ask you to welcome to the stage Margot Wallström, the Foreign Minister of Sweden.
Excellencies, dear friends, I promise this will not be a long speech. I can understand if you feel exhausted and maybe want to enjoy the evening in Stockholm, a sunny one. This is a very ungrateful task to try to kind of wrap up a session that I have not been given the opportunity to listen to. So I will have to invent something and maybe some of my own experience and see if that can contribute in one way or the other to your discussion also in the days to come. And it's a pleasure to be back at this forum, which we are hosting together with SIPRI for the 6th time. And I think it has attracted more and more people and has become more and more interesting for every year. I guess one can say that peace means a lot more than just the absence of war, and that's where we have to start, because peace begins in the minds of people. Communities and societies must be allowed to participate in peace for it to be sustainable. And how do you do that? And I would like to just say shortly something about 3 aspects of peace building: the conflict prevention, crisis response, and peace processes in themselves. And maybe it's a good thing to start with Colombia. I don't know if we have people here from Colombia, but as you know, the war between FARC and the government had been going on since the 1960s with, I would say, millions of victims, if you count both those who were killed in these conflicts, but also victims of, for example, sexual violence. And the peace process that was initiated around 2012 was in a way unique, because it included in different ways victims and local communities, the private sector, civil society, LGBT organizations, and there was, I would say, ultimately also a strong presence of women. And in some of these, they gathered all of these victims, representatives of victims, in big fora. And I actually attended one of these fora as an SRSG on conflict-related sexual violence, and I will never forget it. Because first of all the emotions and all the memories that this brought up, and they feared this in a way. They were afraid of what this would actually bring to the surface, and if it could also initiate, new fightings or new conflicts. But also this woman who came up to me, and she carried with her all the time two photocopied photographs of her two daughters. And they were both missing. One, she understood, was killed, but the other one, she didn't know where she was. And she had been looking for that daughter for so many years. And she wanted to show everybody these kind of pale photographs of her daughters. And that is what these victims lived with. And I think it was very courageous of the then president and the government and all of those involved in the peace process to arrange these forums, because they were difficult to manage, and it brought out exactly all of these victim stories that they were able to share. And you cannot compare the suffering of one or the other. It's very difficult to measure. And how do you compensate for that? How do you create accountability? How do you punish the perpetrators? What do you do with all of the things that came up in these forums? But they did it, and I think it will be, in the long run, an extremely important experience and process. The peace deal then was signed in 2016, one of the few good news that year, one can say, and it included agreements on much more than just the laying down of arms. It mentions land reform, it mentions political participation, it mentions guarantees for social movements, a strategy to tackle drug trafficking, and much more. And we keep on being reminded that the implementation is often the most complicated part of the deal. It's now that Colombia needs support and help to be able to live up to the promises that came and the expectations that came from a peace agreement. Now is their time. Now is the civilians' time. Now the previous soldiers should be given a chance to maybe get educated or do something else than carry an arm, and or carry a weapon. And just as with democracy, peace is something that you have to work on and conquer every day. And even if there have been and are challenges related to the peace process in Colombia, I maintain that this peace process was remarkable because it put the Colombian people at the center, and today both parties, both the former guerrilla FARC and the Colombian government, are jointly working on sustainable peace in their country. Going back then shortly to these three aspects of peace building and conflict prevention. Well, is there anything more difficult to promote? Because we seldom get the credit we deserve for the conflicts that didn't happen. And unfortunately, it's often easier to get support for interventions once there actually is a fire or a conflict or a war. But how many tears would not have been saved if we had been able to prevent Rwanda, Bosnia, South Sudan? And my conviction is that societies that are democratic and inclusive, with gender and social equality, with a strong civil society, they are strongly vaccinated against conflict. And this is one of the reasons why the global backslide of democracy that we experience right now is so worrying. growing authoritarianism together with growing social inequalities have often been a prelude to conflict. And this year, for the first time in decades, more people live in countries with growing authoritarianism and those tendencies than in countries that are making democratic progress. Can you believe it? When we have so much of information and education and understanding, this is still the case. But there is hope. I recently visited the Tunis Forum on Gender Equality, where I met a lot of young civil society activists. And also coming back to inclusive peace building, I heard one interesting example of how women's grassroots organizations took part in conflict early warning mechanisms. And they did so by reporting local peace and security risks and threats to the community, the government and international bodies. And I think this is an example to spread. The other aspect I wanted to mention is peace building, which is crisis response, including peacekeeping and stabilization. And here, a security aspect and approach is often needed to save lives. But also, in interventions to stabilize, we can help steer the course to a more inclusive process. And women in peacekeeping operations is an example. You will expect this from me if I don't talk about women in peace processes. What would it be with this feminist foreign policy? But when we plan for this, when we plan for these interventions, we must think of inclusion and gender from the start. There is no conflict between the need for a quick end of violence and the long-term aim of creating peaceful, just, and inclusive society. And all interventions can be designed to contribute to this. And thirdly and lastly, peace processes. And here, an inclusive approach means focusing more on women and less on men with weapons. And it is understandable that at the crunch time, a hasty deal between leaders of conflicting parties might seem attractive, but sometimes easy come, easy go as well. And a peace where the voices of communities, of victims, of women have been heard in preparations, in negotiations, and implementation will be more deeply rooted and also has a greater chance of lasting longer. We know this from the studies that have been made. So coming back to that example of Colombia, it was women that brought issues of land restitution and victims to the agenda that ensured that confidence-building measures were implemented, that child soldiers were released. So more options, more implementing measures on the table if you bring more actors and more women to the table. There are other processes where women are less visible but still make critical contributions. In Libya and Afghanistan, women, young people and local peace builders have done important work with their local knowledge and commitment. Conflicts are not linear. You can never draw a straight line from a beginning to an end. And their dynamics maybe look more like a child's drawing, with strokes forward, backward, to the sides in all possible directions. And as I said in the beginning, sustaining peace is an ongoing process of constantly strengthening factors that underpin peace, such as confidence, reconciliation, institutions, equality, democracy. And in a way, conflict, in a broader sense, is an inevitable part of life in a society. For a democracy, one can say conflict is vital. And conflict in the meaning of difference in opinions and interests, and letting them meet and clash sometimes, but come out with a peaceful deal or agreement or compromise, or just living together with different opinions and interests. And that's the challenge, of course, how to handle conflicts in a peaceful and constructive way. Strong well-functioning institutions, be they national or in the shape of multilateral cooperation, are the ways of managing this. And this is another reason why today's backsliding of democracy and questioning of international cooperation is such a worrying threat. So to finish, to get back maybe to the main point about peace beginning in the minds of people, you might recognize the source of this because the first words of the Constitution of UNESCO since they so well summarize what peace building is about. Since wars begin in the minds of men, it says, one should maybe say people, it is the minds of men or people that the defenses of peace must be constructed. This is where it starts and where it ends. And in other words, it means putting people at the center of our thinking. And I'm glad that we are doing that today and tomorrow, and I hope that we can keep on doing it in our daily work for peace and development. Thank you all for coming, for being here, for what you're doing every day under often very difficult circumstances, all of you. And enjoy the rest of the evening. I think there will be some kind of announcement after I get off here. So thank you again for listening, and enjoy the evening. Thank you.
We're almost there. Well done. Good evening. Hello. Welcome to the forum. This is a fantastic turnout. We've had a great day. I just need to give you some logistics and some process so that we can enjoy our company together and then the cultural event tonight. Some of you have already seen the surprise. Maestro Karim Wasfi is joining us this evening. He is a cellist, a conductor, a composer, and he is an ambassador of global peace building through his Arts for Peace initiative. He's going to be doing spontaneous spontaneous composition on this stage. I may be doing spontaneous combustion. He will be doing spontaneous composition on this stage with band of Iraqi refugees called Nawaris, who have flown in as well. We're going to do a little interview with him after the reception, and then they will play for us, and we have a couple audiovisual clips for you as well. So we invite you all to stay on. There are light food and snacks here in Mastorget and also in Arkaden. There will be a little bit of work in here when we remove the chairs, so please vacate this area. But you can be in there, there's some drinks, and you can also be on the patio. And then we will invite you back in when it's time to have the cultural event. So please stay with us, and we look forward to an evening of refreshment of both body and soul. Thank you.